truly very brave and courageous man who for years, as a congressman from Texas, has been telling the American people and their elected representatives in Washington that America is headed on a collision course and that it must change its ways. Repeatedly, this congressional statesman and presidential candidate has courageously warned America that it must clean its house and return to its constitutional form of government. A government that is deeply rooted in the firm conviction that America is based on a strong belief in individual liberty. In his own words, we have not come here today to win an election. We have come here today to change the course of history. Ladies and gentlemen, won't you please stand with me and welcome Congressman and President of Canada.
Your car's going to get towed if you don't move it, if it hasn't already been towed, okay? Christopher Mayhew, you here?
Yeah.
Okay, you got to go move it.
Thank you, Mr. Paul. Thank you so much. Thank you, Paul, for that nice introduction, and thank you all for coming and having such a nice reception. I do want to introduce my wife and a granddaughter sitting here, my wife Carol. Right before I came in, there were a few people from the press, and they asked me, "We know you didn't come here for the weather." And I'm not so sure. My wife and I were raised in the north. We were raised in Pennsylvania. She likes the warmer weather. I like all kinds of weather. Snow. I woke up this morning and saw that snow. I thought it was beautiful. But we didn't come for the weather, that is true. And we didn't leave Florida for the weather. We came where the action is. Get delegates, and that's the name of the game. That's how you win an election. Now, Paul mentioned that we do want to change the course of history, and that is true. And we deal in ideas, and very important ideas. But I've also discovered the best way to promote ideas is to win elections, too. In the early years when I first ran for Congress, it was strictly concerned about the future of the country, because it was in the 70s. We lost the last link of our dollar to gold, and I was absolutely convinced that it would lead to an economic disaster. If you look at any economic chart from 1970 on, 71 on, it's been very, very bad when it comes to spending and debt, size of the government, inflation, unemployment problems. It just is exponentially going up, and we've gotten to this point where just printing more money and spending more money doesn't seem to be working. I don't think it's going to. That's why they're giving our ideas a lot more attention at this very moment. Gandhi that said that first they will ignore you, and then they will laugh at you, and then they will fight you. But, you know, I'm starting to suspect, even with the last night's debate, they're starting to respect what we're talking about. This morning I watched CNN for a little bit, and they were talking about what are we going to do with this Ron Paul and his supporters? How are we going to get rid of them? They did come to the conclusion that we are very, very significant, but they want us to go away, but they don't want to offend us. Now, how are they going to manage that? They say we'll hang around for a while longer. That's what we're going to do. charges made against us who want limited government, I'm sure you've been on the receiving end of these charges, is that why do you want to be so radical? You know, what is this idea that you're extremists, radical, eccentrics, and all this? And the answer really is, how did the radicals get in charge of our government? That's the problem. Because we want changes, they want to make it sound terrible. But what's wrong with balancing the budget? Is there anything wrong with that? No. I mean, that sounds like a pretty good idea to me. We have to do it with our own budgets, but federal governments, they think that they can spend forever and keep doing it. What's wrong with the idea of taking away the power from a secret group of individuals to print money at will? You know, I mean, about following the Constitution. You know, that sounds like a pretty reasonable thing to do. But those who don't, who will mock us for wanting to follow the Constitution, I don't know whether they just don't read it, or don't care, or they don't understand it, or just what. But they don't want to pay attention to it. I think one of the problems, if we want to be generous and give them the benefit of the doubt, so many over the last many decades, maybe 40 or 50 years, we have been taught in our educational system that it shouldn't be a rigid document, it should be a flexible document, it should be changing with the times, and therefore they can say, well, anything we want to say, it does. I don't think those individuals who take the oath of office in Washington and never seem to follow it, I don't think they lose any sleep at all. I think they say, well, we're just doing what's right, and this is the way it's supposed to be, and we don't want to be overly rigid. Well, the founders gave us a perfect way of changing things if we want to modernize our Constitution. That is, amend it. Don't just ignore it. Where the crisis has come from. We as a people have allowed our politicians and our courts in the executive branch as well as the legislative branch to just plain out ignore the Constitution. So we are acting outside the law. We don't have law right now. For instance, you know, it's been 50 years or so that the federal government has been involved in public education. Now, the Constitution doesn't address the education only indirectly. It implies that the states and the individuals and the churches would work this out among the states. But there's no explicit authority for the federal government to run public education. Therefore, we shouldn't even have a Department of Education as far as I'm concerned. Let's say the people and the majority say, well, we think the federal government should. If they want to, what they should have done was amend the Constitution, said now the federal government's going to take over education. But the fact that we can go from no federal government authority to be involved to the point where you can't do anything without the federal government permission, that transition, when it was done this way, that means that the rest of the Constitution doesn't have much meaning. The monetary issue. Is there any meaning in the Constitution? It still says only gold and silver can be legal tender. You can't emit bills of credit, which is paper money. There's no authority for a central bank, and look at what we have. So it's the lack of respect for the rule of law that has gotten us into this mess. So someday, if we want to survive as a republic, we're going to have to change that. We cannot be an empire run by the dictatorship of the majority to run a welfare warfare state. If that continues, we're going to go off a cliff in not too many years from now. But right now, I can report to you from my many visits across the country that there's a lot of people that are now with us and are determined that they know exactly where the problems come from and what we ought to do, and our numbers are growing. Has affected us obviously in the monetary policy and the entitlement system. We as a nation have come around to the acceptance that an entitlement is a right. An entitlement sounds pretty good. I mean, if you're entitled to something, it sounds like a right, but it's all mixed up. We as individuals are entitled to our life and to our liberty, but we're not entitled to somebody else's life or liberty or their freedom. Carelessness, now we have developed a system around that we're going to have perfect fairness and perfect equality. It's something that is a goal of socialist communist nations. Perfect equality can be achieved, and it has been achieved in some of those nations, but it's usually by downgrading, putting everybody down in the poverty level, destroying all their rights. Yes, they're equal, but they're equally harmed by what the government has done. What we want to do is make the emphasis on individual liberty. Everybody deserves their life and their liberty. It should be guaranteed by the government. It comes from our Creator in a natural way, and it does not come from our government. Respect for the idea of private property. In many ways, if you defend private property, you can defend all your civil liberties. If you have a church, it's a piece of property. If you protect that property, you protect what's in that property, and that is our churches or our homes or our own personal lives. If that would be protected, then we would be much better off. But what has happened today, because of this idea that we're going to have perfect equality, we've also come to the belief that we can have perfect safety. And of course the founders, and especially Benjamin Franklin, warned, if you're willing to give up your liberties for safety, you're neither going to be safe nor are you going to be free. And unfortunately, that is where we are. We should never have to give up or never be tempted to give up any liberty to be safer, because it won't make us any safer. There's been a dramatic change in direction in these attitudes, although they've been gradual over many, many decades, maybe 70, 80, 90 years. It's been dramatic in the last 10 or 12, especially since 9/11. Because of the horrors of 9/11, people were very concerned, but they were too willing to give up their liberties. All you have to look, if you just see the demonstrations and the pictures of what happens by TSA agents at the airport, how in the world can we survive if we put up with these illegal, unconstitutional searches and prodding of our bodies and x-raying of our bodies, where it hasn't made us any safer whatsoever? That we need to change. After 9/11, which we all shared in the concern about what was happening, Congress rushed the bill to the floor. The bill had been written many years ago and had been just sitting around waiting for an opportunity for it to be passed. And within a week or two, it was brought to the floor, rewritten, updated, a very, very detailed piece of legislation, 800 or 900 pages, 1 hour of debate, and it was vote up and down, yes or no. It was called the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act should never have been passed and ought to be repealed. Yeah. I was sitting next to another congressman when we were voting on it, and I called his attention to it. I said, you know, how come you're voting for this? And I was voting against it, in case you didn't know. So I said, why are you voting for this? And I said, you don't know what's in it. You haven't read it, and you haven't had been around long enough. He says, I know. He says, but he says, how can you vote against the Patriot Act? You know, it's the name that said it. You know, if you see the name on a bill in Washington, what's in the bill is almost always the opposite of what the bill names. So he says, and how could I go home and explain to my constituents that I voted against the Patriot Act right after 9/11? I said, well, but that's your job. Go home and explain it to them. That's what you're supposed to do. Called Repeal the Fourth Amendment Act, it wouldn't have passed. But anyway, it sailed right through. But we're suffering the consequences. We gave up an awful lot because now they can look at all our records and no authentic search warrants, no going to judges. So we have given up and sacrificed a lot. But it's continuing is the big problem. They never give up. Last week we had a fairly decent victory by stopping SOPA. There's a treaty that the president has just signed that has a lot of that same stuff in there. And let's hope our senators know not to ratify that treaty because it's going to do some of the same things in controlling the internet. The internet is the weapon of liberty as far as I'm concerned. There's a continuous attack on our personal liberties and the undermining of our constitutional protections. Take the National Defense Authorization Act. Anybody ever hear about the problems we have with that? That is the bill that put a provision in there saying that the military now has the authority to arrest any American citizen that happens to be a suspect because he was associated with or was at a meeting or visited a website that he might be involved with terrorism. So, well, sure, there's nothing wrong with looking for suspects and getting proper procedures and getting search warrants and checking things out. But to say that an American citizen can be arrested by the military, which means posse comitatus will be repealed, and not only that, the individual American citizen can be held indefinitely and denied even to talk to an attorney. That is not the America that I want to live in. No. Going through the Senate, it had gone through the House last summer and just recently went through the Senate. And there was one provision put in the Senate and it says, if you are arrested and they allow you to have a trial and you're found innocent, they still could hold you forever and put you in prison even if you've been found guilty in a court of law. I mean, this is totally astounding. But there was a certain senator from Kentucky who got that provision removed. Constitution that would, if it would be followed, would save us a lot of grief and a lot of suffering. And that is, how do we go to war? This was one of the reasons we had a revolution. This was one of the reasons that they didn't want the king or the executive branch to go to war without permission of the legislative branch, which meant the body closest to the people. And it said that we cannot go to war unless there is a declaration. Can you imagine how many tragedies could have been prevented since World War II if we had just followed that law and said, don't go to war? And that's one thing I absolutely will promise. We will not be going to war at any whim, and it will only be done for national security reasons with a full declaration of war where you declare you win it and you come home. Of course, we've fought quite a few battles since World War II that are undeclared, but in the last 10, 12 years, We've been involved constantly, and they're ever expanding. Presidents, candidates promise one thing and they do the other. In the year 2000, the Republicans had a candidate who said we shouldn't be in nation building. We shouldn't be the policemen of the world. We shouldn't be involved in nation building and getting involved in internal affairs. But quickly, after the election, did exactly the opposite. Even Obama spoke more softly about bringing troops home and ending wars, but he's expanding wars. He's into Africa now, various states in Africa. They're talking about going into Syria. They can't wait. There's some in Washington can't wait until they can start a war with the Iranians. So I would say that a change in foreign policy would do a lot of good. It would save a lot of lives. It would save a lot of money, too. We ran up the national debt over $4 trillion because of these wars that are ongoing. And when are they going to end? And right today, there was an announcement by the executives, I don't know whether the president or somebody else, was warning Iran, you better behave or we'll have to come back into this country. We gave you all your freedoms, now you better act up because there's chaos over there. We literally have turned that country over to the Shiites who are allies with the Iranians, who are allies with the Chinese. In all these good intentions and pretenses of why they're over there, sometimes it boils down. It's not too far removed from saying, it's all about oil. You know, I think it was a big deal. What is the solution now? We're involved over there, and how do we resolve this, and how do we get out of it? I say just come home. Just bring the troops home. Just this week, the people in Okinawa said, we're tired of you. Why don't you go home? Why do we have to be in Okinawa? Why in Japan? Why do we have to be in South Korea? South Korea's GDP is probably 20 times greater than North Korea. And you know, they can take care of themselves. In the same way with Germany, why do we subsidize their welfare state by providing for their national defense, putting thousands and thousands of soldiers over there, and they spend their money into their economy? I say bring those troops home and let them spend their money in this economy here. Or if you do statistical analysis of what the people are most concerned about, they're concerned about the economy and jobs, and they should be. But what they have to understand is how we got into this mess, because if we continue to do the same things that got us into the mess as a solution, it's not going to work. We got into this mess because government was too big, they spent too much money, they taxed too much, they borrowed too much, they printed too much money, they were too much involved in fixing the interest rates and manipulating the economy. So we get into the crisis that was predictable. The bubbles were readily apparent. We saw the housing bubble there, and the housing bubble burst. So what are they doing? They're spending more money, they're printing more money, they're regulating more, and then they wonder why it's not getting any better. Because they have to, when you get into trouble like this, what you have to do is allow corrections to come. The market says there's too much debt and too much overbuilding. We have to pause, you have to liquidate debt, and you have to get supply and demand back in balance. And we're not doing this. But instead of allowing the debt to be liquidated and wiped off the books, where the big debt was on the financial markets, the Fannie Mae's and the Freddie Macs and the mortgage companies and the banks that were into the derivatives business, they were all going bankrupt. They said, once again, build up fear in the hearts of all the people. You know, we're going to have a depression. We're going to have a depression. We have to bail them out. So what did they do? The Congress passed TARP fund. The Fed got involved in $15 trillion worth of credits. And what happened to the debt? It wasn't liquidated. The debt was bought from the people who had made all the money. They got bailed out. The debt was dumped on us, the middle class, and the middle class lost their jobs. Middle class shrinks. They're getting poorer, and they lost their houses. This is upside down. You know, and some people come and conclude, and I think I mentioned this a little bit in the debate last night about, well, what the solution is just tax the rich. You know, the people who are rich, if you tax them, we can solve all our problems. Well, it's not quite so simple as that. If somebody's rich, because they provided a great service for us, and we made them rich because we buy their product, and they got no benefits from the government and no subsidies. They are being rewarded because we, the consumer, are rewarding them. But the rich right now are the individuals who have benefited from the inflationary system, the transfer of wealth from the middle class to the wealthy, and the people who got benefits from the government contracts and all the bailouts. They not only shouldn't be, they should be taxed, but they shouldn't get the money in the first place. We shouldn't be bailing them out. To make the point about cutting spending, I would cut spending by $1 trillion in the first year. That's what I mean. People get very nervous about that. Other candidates talk about cutting. Nobody's talking about real cuts. Nobody in Washington is talking about, no candidate is talking about. All they're talking about is reducing the proposed increases over the next 10 years. You know, the automatic cuts that came from the fiasco of last summer and the failure of the super committee, which was a super mess, the $1.2 trillion is over 10 years. So that's a little over $100 billion a year cut of proposed increases. Not real cuts, proposed increases. That means that the proposed deficit of $9 trillion is going to be $8 trillion. And yet our national debt's going up $100 billion a month. And they think they're dealing with the problem. So we have to change our attitude, but we, the people, have to decide what we're going to put up with and what you're going to put up with in Washington. So if you want to change, you have to decide whether you really want to be the policeman of the world. And I don't want to be the policeman of the world. Into the entitlement system, the government, just by running up debt and printing money, will take care of everybody. I think the housing fiasco demonstrates that even the well-intentioned who wanted to make sure everybody had a house, it didn't work out that way. We enriched the wrong people and bailed out the wrong people. The people we were trying to help with these programs ended up losing their houses. But in my proposal in the budget, it's cutting this $1 trillion. Actually, I put provisions in here to try to protect the neediest and the ones who become the most dependent on government. Those on the retirement, those who were promised their Social Security checks, those who were enticed into government medicine. So I would want to protect Social Security, and it can be done if we change our attitude about government. We could protect Social Security, we could protect the medical benefits for both the elderly and the children and some of these Medicaid programs, but they would be high on the list for protection. If we don't do that, everything's going to go down the tube because you're going to have runaway inflation and these programs will fail. Because the more you write the checks and send the money out to the retirees, Social Security, the less they buy. The retirees are already know that their standard of living is going down because their cost of living is going up. And that could get much worse. So that's why we must cut. But there has to be priorities. I mentioned Department of Education. I have 5 departments that I would cut. I'd go back to 2006 baseline budgeting. You could save the money. We could work our way out of this, but it would not be easy. But I don't see it as a sacrifice. I wouldn't come to you and say, well, I know the answer here, and every one of you have to sacrifice. I think the people who have to sacrifice, who've been living, the ones living off the government, that's the ones that have to sacrifice. And those who are willing to take care of themselves, it's not going to be a sacrifice to you if you pay less taxes. If we could work to the day where you don't have an income tax, wouldn't that be free? History to be careful. A republic is not going to be protected unless the people really want it. It has to be a moral and a religious society that would protect a true republic and protect freedoms. I believe we have more freedom from the republic. I don't think we have a republic. I think we have pure democracy where if you can get coalitions together and come up with majority, they can run roughshod off the minority. Right now, the minority of people who would like to get the government out of their lives and they'd like to take care of themselves, not only getting out of their economic lives, they'd like to govern out of their personal lives as well. And under those circumstances, the whole system would be so different. We'd emphasize different things. But the free society should be such a welcome. Freedom really brings people together. And that's why I think if you want to have a society that gets along and is diverse, everybody wants their freedom, but they might want it for a different reason. We don't insist to have freedom of religion so everybody has to follow the same religion. We have freedom of religion so people get to pick their religion or no religion whatsoever, and we put up with that. But as soon as it comes down to what we do with our own bodies, what we put into our own bodies, and what our habits are and social values are, sure, some people will abuse their freedom, but just because somebody won't be religious doesn't mean we can have a mandate and say, you will be religious. It's ridiculous. I mean, we've gotten to the point now where the federal government tells us whether or not we can drink raw milk, and I think that's pretty bad. Religious freedom, and that's a pretty important freedom. We determine our eternity with that particular freedom, and we know about intellectual freedom. We're allowed to read books and study different subjects. But as soon as it comes to people's bodies, all of a sudden the government says, we're going to protect you against yourself. Governments, once we concede to the government that they're going to protect us from ourselves, believe there's not much left. You have to protect you from yourself, and you have to suffer the consequences if you don't take care of yourself, and you can't depend on somebody else to take care of you if you mess up. You know, I've gotten a little long-winded because we want to get a few questions in, but let me just finish on a very positive note, because I've been talking about these issues for a long, long time. I got involved in the 70s. I was in and out of politics and did a lot of medicine too. But today there is a difference. It's different than 30 years ago. It's different than 4 years ago. Take, for instance, this issue that I was talking about last night about Cuba. The whole thing is different now than 4 years ago. Twice as many people agree with the idea that we ought to not have sanctions on Cuba, that we ought to start talking to the Cubans and traveling back and forth with Cuba. Movement is alive and well. It's growing now. I used to think of it as a few young people and a remnant. Now the remnant is coming alive, and the number of young people joining the cause is growing by leaps and bounds. The momentum is there, and it's not going to be easy because those who have the power and the control will cling to it, and that is what's happening in Washington. Everybody's clawing away at a pie that is shrinking. If we don't want to claw away at the pie that is taken, which is redistribution of wealth, we want to enhance our freedom. If we enhance our freedom and understand how free markets work, believe me, that is the way to achieve peace and prosperity.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I'll tell you, we had to make a management decision here regarding Q&A and or trying to get some photos in, and we've chose to go with the photos because I know for a lot of you folks it might be the first time you've seen the Congressman. You might at least like to say hi to him as we do this. What we're going to do, we've got about a half an hour, and I'll take the blame for the shortness of time, but he's trying to get to as many places as he can during this trip. You've got your caucuses coming up, and we want to get us to every place we can get. So what we want to do is this. Folks who are not interested in a photo or any kind of saying hi can exit out the door this way. Those who would like to take a photo, and we only have time to do photos. I know it sounds a little restrictive, but it's just, look at the crowd. Yeah. It's tremendous. What we're going to do is we want to very slowly and respecting your neighbors.
goodbye, sorry.
Go down this way, around the back of this curtain. Not yet.